Hi, and welcome to this Noodle tutorial. My name is Johan, and in this video tutorial series, we'll build out a simple survey app. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to set up and use pages and a page router so that we can have navigation between different screens in our app. And we'll also learn how to take existing built-in UI components and customize them. We'll start with a simple customization, and then make the customizations progressively more complex as the series continues. Before we get started, let's have a quick look at what the app will look like once we're finished with this tutorial. We will set up the page router and add a few pages to that, and then we'll focus on making the first page in this experience. I'm going to create this gray background that is responsive to a certain degree and build out this header. Then I'll focus on customizing these radio buttons to get this nice background when they're selected. And finally, we'll tackle this section with the buttons. Let's get to it. Okay, so I've created a new project from the Hello World template. I'll maximize my node editor, and then I'll delete this text node. I'm going to start working on that gray background that we saw before. I'm going to use a group node and name it app container. Let's put it in the other group, and let's give it a gray background and a bit of breathing space by setting some margins. I'll also give it some padding. It's not super important right now, but it'll be nice for later. Okay, so now if I change the size of my preview window here, we can see that I have a nice background. I'd like the gray background to always have a minimum width, and I also don't want my content to spread out too much if it's on a display that's like an ultra wide or so. So let's set a max width as well. Let's do 350 pixels minimum width and 520 pixels maximum width. Let's see how that looks if I change the size of the preview window. Yeah, that's nice. Now the content won't ever grow beyond 520 pixels. I do want this to always be in the middle though, so let's change the alignment of the group here. Cool. Now we have our app container set up. Let's create our header. For the header, let's create a new visual component by clicking here and naming it header. Then I'm going to drag it into the app component and place it in the app container here so that we can see it in the preview window when we're working. Back in the header, let's give the group the name header as well, and let's add a text node. I'm going to style the text a bit. Let's make the size a bit smaller and set the font to Roboto medium. And I want this to be this dark gray color, or actually this dark color instead. And also let's make sure that whatever text this node contains, it's always uppercase. This text node will hold the title for the progress bar we saw in the design. Let's leave it for now like this and get on with the progress bar. For the progress bar, I'm going to use a group node. I'll call it progress bar. I'm going to give it 8 pixels in height so that it's not too big, and let's make it white. Let's push it down a bit with top margin here, and let's round the corners with, let's say 100 pixels. This is my progress bar background. Now let's copy this node and place it inside here to make the inner part of the progress bar. We'll update the name of the group to keep track of what everything is, and I'm also going to reset the margin, so now it's inside the other group. And let's use the primary color for this inner part and make it 50% in width so that we can see what it would look like when we are at 50% progress. Nice. Now, the progress bar is going to show us which page we're on and how far we've progressed. And I want the filler part to animate every time we move to a new step in this survey app. To achieve that, I'm going to use a states node. I'm going to have a state for each step or page in this survey app, so let's create these states by clicking this plus sign. The first state I'll call init. We will see how this is used to get a nice animation of the progress bar when we get to the first page of the app. Then we'll have a state for each step or page. So step 1, step 2, step 3, and finally a done state. Now that I have my different states, I'm going to add some values that I want to be different depending on which state we're in. So the width of the progress bar will be different depending on which state I'm in, and also the title for the progress bar will change. The progress width is going to be a number, so I don't have to change anything here, but the progress title is going to be a string, so let's change that here. Let's fill in what the values are going to be for each state. In the init state, the width will be 0, and the title will be step 1. We'll have the same title in the step 1 state, but the width will be 25. The reason the title is the same is because when the app is initialized, we will see the page for the first step, but I want the progress bar to animate from 0 to 25% width when the app loads. Now let's fill in the values for the other states. I'll speed it up a bit, but then let it linger on the final values so that you have a chance to fill in the same values if you're following along in your own version of Noodle. Now we're ready to hook up the states node to my UI. The progress title will be connected to my text node, and the progress width will be the width of my inner progress bar group. Let's see what it will look like if we change the state of the states node. So let's tell the states node to show the step 1 state. And as I change to the other states, we can see how the title changes and the progress bar gets filled in. We will control what state we are in a little bit later, so let's set it back to the init state, and then the final thing I want to do here is to change how much space the header component takes up. When I select the group node, we can see in the preview window that it takes up 100% of the available height by default. So let's change the dimensions property of the group to be content height and explicit width, and we will leave that width at 100%. So that's better, but let's add a bit of padding so that when we add other UI components, the header isn't too close to them. Alright, so we have a nice container for our app, and we've created a header that will let the user know where they are in the app. Now we need the actual pages that contain the questions for our survey. In Noodle, when you want to create an experience where you can navigate between different pages, you want to use a page router. The page router node is similar to the group node, but it's exclusive for handling page nodes. The page router keeps track of which pages it can navigate between, navigation history, and what the current page is, and it has properties to control how it wraps its content. It's optimized for web type navigation, so this is what you want to use for most of your navigation needs. Let's put the page router under the header. And let's add some pages directly from the page router by clicking this button and then the plus sign. Let's make 3 pages, one for each step in the survey. We want to let the page router know which page it should display from the start. And we click the little overflow menu here and select the Make Start Page option. Notice how this icon changed to indicate that this is now the start page. We can now see out here in the component pane that we have 3 new components, and the icon in the front of the name indicates that they are pages. Let's select the step 1 page, since that's the start page and what is currently being shown inside the page router. I'm going to start by adding a text node that will contain the first question in my survey, and we can see here that it appears once I've added it to my page node. Now let's style the text node. Change the font size, make the color dark, and let's make the font big and bold. And lastly, let's put in the question. How often do you want to eat noodles? that looks good. Then let's add a group for the rest of our content and give it an appropriate name. And then if you remember from the design, we're going to have some radio buttons, and those have to be inside of a radio button group. So let's add one of those. Then let's add 2 radio buttons. And then let's center the content in this group. Now let's look at the radio buttons. In order for this to work, they need to have different values set. And when we create them, they all come with the same default value. So let's change the value of the second radio button to 1. Then as a small example, I'm going to make a string node and give it the value 0 and then connect it to the radio button group's value property. And now we see that the first radio button is selected. If I change the string's value to 1, it is the second radio button that starts out selected. And of course, I can click them as well. Now I want to customize what the radio buttons look like. So I'm going to create a new visual component that I'll call custom radio button. And then cut out this radio button from the step 1 page and paste it into my custom radio button component like this, and then put it inside of the group. If I then navigate back to the last component, let's place this custom radio button in the radio button group so that we again can see what we're working with in the preview window. So this still looks the same, so let's style it a bit more. But okay, let's jump back and add one more before we start the styling so that we can get the margins and all that stuff correct. Okay, so now let's look at the group that the radio button is in. I want this to be a specific height, 48 pixels to be exact, and then some bottom margin so that we have space between each other. Then I want them to have a white background, so I'm going to use a group node for that. I'll put it here and give it a white background. Now, the group is on top of the radio button, but I want it to be behind the radio button, and I can get that if I tell this group to be position absolute. Now the white group is positioned so that it takes up all the space that is available in the parent, and then any other nodes that have their position set to in layout will be on top of the white background. Now let's center the radio button by using the align and justify content property on the group here, and let's add some padding, and it's worth mentioning that the padding doesn't affect the nodes that have absolute position, so the white background fills in everything. This white background should have rounded corners, so something like 100 pixels, and then I would very much like these items to be 100% of the available screen width. It's actually the radio button group that is set as default to only take up the size of its content, so if we change the radio button group's dimensions to be content height and explicit width, we get what I'm looking for. Cool, so how do I set different labels and values on my custom radio buttons then? You see that when I have the custom radio button selected, the property panel is empty. Well, we need to use a component inputs node, so let's jump into the custom radio button and add that. So we can add our own ports on the component inputs node, and we can call them what we want. But since it's the value and label on the radio button we want to be able to set, let's name our ports that. And then let's make some connections like this. Value to value and label to label. Now we can set the value and label on our custom radio button from the step 1 page, like this. Let's do more than once a week for the label on this one and keep the value at 0. And then in my second one, we'll set the value to 1 and the label to once a week. And that works, except for I only want the white background to show on the radio button that is selected. So back in my custom radio button, I'm going to connect the checked property of the radio button to the visible property of the background group. Now, since only one radio button will be checked at one time, only the checked one will show the white background. Let's rename this group as well, and then back in the step 1 page, let's add the rest of the custom radio buttons. Let's update the labels and values for all of these components as well. Okay, so remember the progress bar? I want that to show that we're on the step 1 page, but when I reload my app, the progress bar doesn't update. We need to set the correct state in the header component, so let's fix that. Let's go back to the header component and let's add a component inputs node. I'll create one port, name it current page, and if I connect this to the state property of the states node, and the value it gets matches any of the state names, it means that state will be selected. So let's make that connection like this, and then go back to the app component. The page router keeps track of the current page's title, and since I have named my pages exactly the same as the states in the header node, I can use this current page title as the input to my header to control which state should be shown. If you have a spelling error so that the page titles and state names don't match, then this will not work. So be sure to check that they are exactly the same. And now we can see that the current page title is step 1, and it's fed into the header, and if we go into the header, we see that the step 1 is fed into the states node. And because we have a state that matches that exact name, the states node will change into that state. So now that I refresh, the states node is originally in the init state, but once the page router has loaded the step 1 page, the states node will transition into the step 1 state and we get this nice little animation. Very cool. So the last thing from my design is to create the button section at the bottom. So let's make a new group and let's change it to be only the content height, and then let's add a button to this group. This is going to be my primary button, so first I'm going to style it a bit. Let's make it explicit width and height and set the width to 120 pixels and the height to 48 pixels. If you wonder where I get these numbers from, I get them from a design that my designer friend made, and I'm afraid to come up with my own numbers, so I just use whatever they specified. Then let's change the border radius so it's in style with everything else. And the label should say next. And let's also give it an icon. I'm going to move the icon to the right side and then change it to this arrow. A bit more spacing will be good. And that looks nice. When I interact with it, hover looks good, but when I press it, it looks a bit off. So let's fix that by going into the pressed state and changing the icon color to the primary color. And now that I try it again, that is much better. Okay, so I'm going to change back to the neutral state for this button, and I really like this styling. So I'm going to save this styling in a variant that I will call primary button. I'm now going to copy this button and add it to the group here, and then change the layout of the group to horizontal, and I'll have the group justify the content using the space between option. Then I want this button to be a secondary button, so I'm going to just give them those names so it's easier to keep track of. So for this secondary button, I want that to have a different style. That means I want to create a new style variant, and I can do that if I click on the drop-down list of variants and then select the plus sign and create one called secondary button. Oops, a small spelling mistake. Let's fix that. I'm going to edit this secondary variant, so I'll click the Edit Variant button here. If I don't click the Edit Variant button and make changes, then I wouldn't be editing the style variant. I would instead be changing the properties of this specific button. So let's make sure we're in the Edit Variant mode, and let's make this secondary style hopping. Let's change the position of the icon and the icon itself. Sometimes we just need to refresh the preview to see the variant changes that we've made so far, so let's do that. Notice the outline of the Properties panel. It means that we are still editing the style variant and not the specific button. For the secondary variant, the background color should be transparent and instead have a border style that's solid with the primary color. And let's also change the icon color to use that primary color, and the text style should use the same color. Now let's check the hover and press state. Here, the press state is good, but the hover state needs to change. So let's select the hover state while we're still in the editing variant mode, and let's just change the background color to this primary light color here, and that looks good to me. Now I'm done with this variant, so I'm going to click the back button here. This secondary button is not for going forward, so it should not say next. Let's change the label to say back instead. I'm going to want to use this button section on all my pages, so it's a prime candidate to turn into a component. I'll create a new visual component and call it button section. Then I'll cut out the group and buttons from my page here and paste it into the button section component after I delete the default group and then add this component back to my page. I want to be able to get the button's signals from outside this component, so I need to add a component outputs node. I'll create two ports, primary clicked and secondary clicked, and then hook up the click signals to the outputs. Finally, for the buttons, when I'm in step 1, I don't want to show the secondary button, so let's make that controllable from a component input. I'll make a port called show secondary and connect it to the visible property of the secondary button. So now, back here in the step 1 page, I can tell the button section to not show the secondary button by making sure that this is unchecked. Alright, one more thing in this first video. Let's make it so that we can navigate to the step 2 page so that we can continue on that page in the next video. I'm going to add a navigate node, and then when I get the primary clicked signal from the button section, I want to navigate. And I also need to tell the navigate node which page it should navigate to, which is step 2. And now if I click the next button, look at that, we navigated to the second step. Awesome. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching this tutorial, where we learned a bit about page routers and navigation in Noodle. We also did a simple customization of a built-in node, and in the next video we'll continue making some custom checkboxes for our little survey app. Hope to see you there, and happy noodling!